No steam engine, no stock exchange, no algorithm, just a root pulled from the ground. When people are asked to name the single most important driver of modern economic growth, they usually point to machines, money, or markets. They talk about industrial breakthroughs, capital accumulation, or financial innovation. Almost no one would say a potato. Yet for nearly 2 centuries, this unremarkable crop quietly reshaped the global economy from the bottom up. The potato did not merely feed people, it altered how many people could exist, where they could live, how cheaply they could work, and how much power states could project. It reshaped labor markets, fueled population booms, strengthened armies, and made empires possible without anyone fully noticing in real time. That invisibility is what makes the story unsettling, because when the most powerful force in a system looks boring and obvious in hindsight, it usually means the risk is building unseen. Before the potato, Europe lived permanently on the edge of hunger. This was not a temporary condition, but a structural one. For centuries, population growth hovered near subsistence limits, rising slowly during good periods and collapsing violently during bad ones. Diets depended heavily on grain, and grain was fragile. Weather shocks, war, poor storage, and slow transport meant that a single failed harvest could erase generations of progress. Most people lived close enough to starvation that long-term economic planning barely existed. Wages stayed low because productivity stayed low. Families had many children because survival was uncertain, and cities grew cautiously because they could not reliably feed themselves. Power was constrained not by technology or ambition, but by calories. The potato entered this system quietly, carried from the Andes by Spanish explorers in the late 16th century. At first, Europeans distrusted it. It grew underground, was absent from religious texts, and seemed unfamiliar and suspicious. In many places it was ignored or fed to animals. But economic revolutions rarely announced themselves clearly. Over time, necessity overcame superstition, and as the potato spread across Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, something fundamental changed. The crop produced far more calories per acre than grain, thrived in poor soil, resisted cold climates, and grew underground, making it harder to steal or destroy during war. Families could survive and ebb and grow on land that would have failed them a generation earlier. This was not a marginal improvement. It was a productivity shock. As food constraints loosened, population growth accelerated. This happened not because wages rose, but because survival became easier. That distinction matters. Europe did not become wealthy first and then grow larger. It grew larger first and then had to absorb the consequences. More people meant more workers competing for jobs, which pushed wages down even as total output increased. Rural families sent children to cities, not because factory work paid well, but because there were too many mouths to feed at home. Urbanization accelerated, and early factories filled with laborers whose bargaining power was limited by sheer abundance. The potato did not build factories, but it made large-scale industrialization possible. States quickly felt the effects, even if they did not fully understand the mechanism. Regions that adopted potato cultivation earlier could field larger armies, sustain them longer, and recover more quickly from war. Population density became military depth, and military depth became power. Governments across Europe promoted potato cultivation not out of humanitarian concern, but out of strategic necessity. A well-fed population was healthier, easier to tax, easier to govern, and easier to mobilize. The rise of modern states did not begin with constitutions or central banks. It began with food security, and in this case, that security rested on a single crop. By the early 19th century, the potato had become invisible infrastructure. Entire populations depended on it. Without fully realizing, they were betting their future on a biological monoculture. Monocultures are highly efficient, but they also concentrate risk. When a system reorganizes itself around one extraordinary input, it gains scale, speed, and power. But it also becomes fragile. That fragility does not announce itself. It waits. By the time Europe understood how deeply it depended on the potato, there was no easy way back. Nowhere was this dependence more extreme than in Ireland. There, the potato was not just a staple, it was the entire system. A single acre could feed a family for a year. Landholdings shrank accordingly, and the population exploded. Between 1700 and 1845, Ireland's population roughly tripled, from about 2.5 million to over 8 million, without an industrial base to absorb that growth. Wages did not rise, agriculture did not diversify, and institutions did not strengthen. Most rural families lived almost entirely on potatoes and milk, not out of ignorance, but because the arithmetic worked. The same efficiency that made survival possible also eliminated redundancy. When the potato failed, there was nothing behind it. That failure arrived in 1845 with a fungus *phytophthora infestans. Potato blight spread across Europe, but its impact in Ireland was catastrophic. Within a year, the staple crop collapsed. Within a few years, more than 1 million people were dead, and another million had emigrated. A quarter of the population disappeared. This was not simply a natural disaster. Food still existed, grain continued to be exported, markets functioned, and contracts were honored. What failed was not supply in the abstract, but access. Ireland had optimized 4 calories per acre, not for resilience. That distinction proved fatal. Economic systems rarely collapse at their weakest point. They collapse at their most efficient one. Growth often comes from narrowing dependence onto whatever works best. And when that input breaks, the entire structure shudders. The potato did not just fuel population growth, it reshaped power. The calorie surplus. It created fed factories, armies, and empires, underwrote Europe's rise, and simultaneously planted the seeds of catastrophic vulnerability. None of this required bad intentions. No one designed the system to fail. It evolved toward efficiency because efficiency worked until it did not. The modern global economy has its own potatoes. Oil is one of them. For over a century, cheap and abundant energy rewired transportation, industry, and geopolitics. Entire economies were built on the assumption that oil would remain available and affordable. When that assumption is disrupted, inflation surges, politics fracture, and conflicts suddenly acquire economic justifications. Semiconductors are another example. A handful of highly specialized factories now underpin everything from consumer electronics to advanced weapons systems. The efficiency is extraordinary, but the fragility is obvious once you look for it. Shipping lanes, fertilizers, payment networks, and energy grids all function as modern potatoes inputs, so foundational that they disappear from daily awareness until they fail. Markets do not respond first to fundamentals. They respond to realization. Prices move violently when people suddenly understand that the invisible foundation they relied on is unstable. This is where financial mistakes are made. Efficient systems reward complacency, and when they break, they punish those who assumed stability was permanent. The people who suffer most are rarely the architects of the system. They are those who lived inside it, without realizing how narrow its foundations were. This is why economic history is not academic, it is defensive. The Irish farmer did not need to understand the biology of fungi to survive. He needed redundancy. The modern investor does not need to predict every shock. They need to recognize where dependency has been mistaken for permanence. Real wealth is not just about growth, but about survivability. The lesson of the potato is that prosperity can be real and transformative while still being dangerous. And that the most powerful forces in an economy are often the least discussed, precisely because they work so well until they do not.